The 7 deadly sins, or cardinal sins, of which catalyze man's conflict within the self, coined by Tertullian and continued by Christianity in the 4th century, colloquially listed as pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, sloth, and lastly, gluten, the most insidious of killers, a structural protein adding to the elastic network of wheat grain. So, anyway, this anime is called Berserk of Gluttony. This video is part 1 of 2 parts, so keep your eyeballs peeled like a potato for that second one when it comes out. Speaking of potatoes, this glowy boy faces off against some neon goobers, dicing them like potatoes, and yearning for more of that zesty carnage. Now, a Mexican fella is ambushed by some less incandescent goobers somewhere in nature. He's saved by a squad of cool warriors though. This is a city, and this is a hungry lad named Fate. The heroes discuss their spoils, making the pleb jealous and causing him to reflect on his skill, gluttony, which gives him no stats and prevents him from sating his hunger. Later, the paparazzi, barons of bougie, apparent protectors of the kingdom, 3 holy knights, waddle through the streets, spooking the denizens by being existent. This particular gaggle are the Valeric siblings, known for their dastardly behavior, as displayed here by this unfortunate orange-loving fat man. Bleb is hungry still, and picked on by the triple threat trio, who toss his pay to the ground and stomp his fingies. This continues as Vape reflects on being given a dumb skill. A babe arrives just in time to deliver proper justice upon the evildoers by scolding them lightly. It's Roxy Hart, a name so on the nose that is one with the mucus. Her attempts at chastisement are instantly shot down, but she is able to resuscitate Fate with her angelic demeanor. He gets a nurturing tending to, words of reassurance, and the promise of help should he need it. Fate immediately runs off to go have a soup and contemplate. The bartender expresses concern about his employers, understanding of the way this world works. Nate doesn't want none of that sass, and flees. Despite having eaten, he still has the hungries. Suddenly, thieves. He goes to snitch, causing Rocky to charge into battle, leaving him alone to protect the gate. A man. Time to do the job. He jumps into Fate's spear for some reason, killing himself instantly and activating Fate's skill for the first time. He probably absorbed that criminal's juice. Roxy rushes over to her pleb to check on him, but gets her mind read. This startles the Pate, who is in shock from killing a man, awakening and hearing Roxy's thoughts. He puts that aside and focuses on not causing trouble for his crush, who is thankful and offers him a job at her rich girl house, giving him the possibility of a future. Fate isn't so sure about agreeing to this offer, but Rompy essentially tells him that he is useless as a gate guard. He accepts this immediately, then later checks his stat window, wondering how all this happened. It was obviously gluttony, but he is slow. Fate figures that killing some monsters might help, and so the next day goes to purchase a sword. He is slow and poor though, only being offered weapons from the trash barrel. It's all good because he has Identify now, and can find the best one of the bunch, which happens to be this guy, who he relates to on a personal level. It says hello, inciting a brief schizophrenic episode. After Fate recovers, the sword introduces itself as greed and is purchased. Meanwhile, the Valerics are peeved that Rocky pinched their punching bag. Blue Bobcut settles his pink sister though, and heads off to research how to be immortal. Fate and his cool new sword bond in a field by murdering gobos and grinding stats. It's a good old fun time, and our protagonist is finally sated for the first time in his life. Greed takes the opportunity to tell him about his gluttony skill, stating that he shouldn't tell people about it due to defying divine law. Fate is shook, but decides that's probably fine. Him and his sword bond again. Then they collect those goobers' ears and head back to town, earning a solid couple dollars. Suddenly, Fate encounters a human trafficker mid-trafficking sesh. It's time to act as a good boy should, and he gets going. His opponent is a tough one, but Fate must overcome for the sake of that little girl. An old lady teaches some cretins about their god, Laplace, who gave them all skills. This one is despondent, upset that Laplace is a bitch who doesn't treat people equally. One of the younglings is missing, Sahara. Vape is here to save the day though. However, he wasn't very stealthy about it and has to fight. Greed gives his master some helpful combat advice. They retreat while this guy licks his knife. Fate gets the jump on him, causing his foe to charge and attack. They clash, but Greed wasn't made in a sweatshop and the trafficker is felled, after which Fate tortures some information out of him, revealing that the Valerics are behind the kidnapping, specifically this Valeric. Fate and his rescued orphan go get some meat skewers in town. Sahara has never partaken of the meats before and cries tears of joy, receiving another as a treat. Later, Fate delivers the desert back to the Cretin cage and gives her advice on staying strong, similar to the advice his dad gave back yonder years ago. Fate bonds with Greed by analyzing his new stats on the way home, noting that he wishes to get stronger. Anyway, his fit is trash and needs an upgrade before his employment under the Hart family. Unfortunately, Roxy's dad was just killed by a dragon, and dark days await the Holy Knights and the Hart household. The next day, Fate is equipped with a sack and vest and approaches the Hart house. It's big and lush. Speaking of which, here is Roxy. Fate is smitten and automatically flirts. Then they get to touring. Rocky already made a grave for her dad and immediately befouls the mood with her lamentations. Fate had no idea about all of this and sulks. It's all good though, because Roxy radiates joy. They go to touch hands, but Fate recoils from fear of reading her mind again. It's the head maid who exudes a physical manifestation of order. Fate eats some meats and does chores for a week, giving him time to bond with these old guys who think he's schizophrenic for talking with his sword all the time. Roxy summons Fate to the garden for some tea and talk. Fate can't concentrate because he hasn't killed anything for a time and is starving, so much so that he calls Roxy his dad. They bond over their killed fathers briefly, then Roxy gives him the nickname Faye and equates him to family. Unfortunately, the hunger gets the best of Cake and he passes out, awakening sometime in the night. Greed tells him that he has to slurp up some more souls or he'll go nuts, which causes his eyeballs to glow red, and so he exits the castle town while reflecting on how delicious everyone looks, off to do some slaughtering. Goblins are no longer enough, so he moves to the next zone to whack some bigger goblins. Itedakumasu indeed. Fate does not wish to feel hungry ever again, and the second course arrives through the foliage. A goblin king who looks pretty tasty. He goes for a plunging attack, but afterwards decides to look at a nearby corpse instead of his opponent, and is forced to dodge around. Greed gives him some advice, and the big boy is felled after a brief exchange. After absorbing the Goblin King's soul or something, Greed senses that it's time to evolve, so Fate gives him all his stats in exchange for a secondary form, a magical bow which shoots edgy, heat-seeking lightning, and so those little orphans get to dine well on goblin ears this fine night. Sometime later, Fate catches Foxy trying to sneak out of the house, dressed as a milkmaid. She informs him about her duty to inspect the town, reflecting on the head maid's wrath should she be found out. I don't get why this would be frowned upon, but whatever. Roxy seduces Fate with her aggressive tactics, and as he attempts to flee, reels him back with the idea that he escort her, and so they wander around. Roxy is way too excited about this, and comes up with an alias to prevent people from suspecting her. As she ideates, Greed chimes in with advice, which Fate schizophrenically rejects out loud with his actual voice, in front of Roxy, who thinks he is rejecting her excitement. He reassures her that he doesn't belong in an institution, and together they blush. Greed comments on their romance, which causes Fap to again schizophrenically outburst with anger. Roxy focuses more on the fact that he is about to chuck his sword in a lake rather than Fate's psychology. Then she just decides to comment that he actually has a sword, which Fate is suddenly hesitant to admit to owning due to his ardent desire to keep his gluttony skill a secret. However, you're in too deep, bud, and Greed launches himself at Roxy, who simply tells him to do maintenance on it. As they walk, Fate continues to talk to Greed out loud about how nice Ronk smells, which doesn't arouse suspicion because Roxy needs hearing aids. It's market time in the city, complete with grapes, fresh from the vineyard. Grapey. Suddenly, a knight begins to stroll, making the plebs nervous. Fate's gentle hunger pangs, somehow, through the swathes of people, notify the red-haired knight to his presence. Fate apologizes for his insolence, but his aggressor wishes to stomp so badly. Roxy intervenes with her iconic verbal scolding. However, as an acting member of the proletariat, she isn't allowed to speak to a holy knight in such a way. Unfortunately, literally everyone in the town suddenly recognizes her as Lady Roxy. Greed suggests that they play it off like they're lovers, so they do, somehow dissolving the situation by making it incredibly awkward for everyone. After running off, Fate enters Roxy's thoughts. Finding that she is enjoying clinging to him, she continues on, leaving Fate to reflect on his mistakes. He catches Roxy ogling some gemstones, of which she insists that since she is a girl, she is, of course, interested. The rock peddler peddles his rocks, geodes to be precise, and Fate uses his identify skill to see which ones actually have crystals in them. However, Roxy is ensnared by a blue hexagon. Fate notices and misses his chance to flirt as Roxy moves on to more serious matters by asking where the warriors hang out. She overhears some fellas talking about the recent decline in goblin population and the orphanage who keeps getting ears donated to it. Roxy stops to inquire further, only making the point clearer that she needs to find warriors to speak with. Her true intentions of the investigation is to find information about a suspected wandering monster. Fate is shook, realizing that he is probably this wandering monster. Later, Vape enters the old tavern he used to frequent, whose owner was in the middle of mourning Fate's death. Anyway, after skipping over that part, the proprietor congratulates him on his job and girlfriend. Roxy explodes a cup of water in shock. Greed interprets this event for Fate, and he also explodes a cup of water in shock. Now, back to business. A customer reported finding a pile of goblin corpses without their ears chopped off, so it must be some mystery beast. This guy wanders in to state that the prevailing theory is that it's a lich, whom the Holy Knights are determined to defeat. This is news to Roxy, Fate, and Pede. Fate is rightly concerned that he may have to face Roxy on the battlefield when some traveling warriors come over to harass his girl. She obliterates that nerd, undoes her braids, actually had to rewind to see what she did because I literally didn't notice, and introduces herself as Roxy Hart, much to their surprise. Except this guy, he remains smug for guessing correctly, while the warriors beg for their lives. Rocco doesn't wish to claim their monies or their lives, and instead expresses shame at having them reduced to such fear simply because she is a holy knight. They get along, as Fate decides to dedicate his existence to her. Later, this guy rubs his sword in a shack. Greed is elated. On the way back, Fate questions why she was left out of the monster hunt, but it's clear that the Vlerick family is up to something. Speaking of which, they're absorbing the life essence out of this child. Epoxy immediately scolds them, while Fate releases the kid, ignoring the trio's rough greeting. After the securing of the hostage, Roxy questions the maltreaters about the lack of communication regarding the hunt, receiving a lackluster response. They part ways, but not after some brief taunting. Roxy apologizes, then they begin escorting the child back to his mothership. It's very cliche and romantic. Fate reflects on a time he was lost and escorted back by an attractive night lady. They found the mothership, and Fate gazes at Roxy for a while, who states that should they get in trouble, he should take joint responsibility. And so they do, and he does, then bathes with this old man. Later, Greed gets him to buy a special mask, which conceals his identity with magic, making sure to purchase a little geode as well, of which he presents to his girl as a gift for taking such good care of him. She obliterates the stone with her Herculean grippers, finding it to be the exact color she enjoyed earlier. So blue, so shiny. She wishes to bequeath upon Fate a year's supply of meat, but is denied. Meanwhile, the villainous Holy Knights begin their talks. Fate spooks some plebs away from his killing fields, intent on preparing for when he is inevitably attacked by the Holy Knights. Back at the Hart House, Fat is tired from living a double life when Roxy approaches to give him a special mission. They go harvest some grapes together and visit her mother. She eras in Fate's direction, welcoming him to the crib and asking if he is dating her daughter. Fate gives a favorable response, stating that he wishes to serve her for the rest of his life. He doesn't seem to realize that this implies marriage, and Roxy flees from his autism. The mother is worried for her Holy Knight, but Fate reassures her that Raleigh is doing a fine job. To chill out some, she listens to a tune on her boombox and reflects on a time when she and her late father were being Holy Knights together. Later, the grape picking is going well, and the juice flows spectacularly through the vineyards. One of the workers expresses his thanks to Roxy, who typically not only assists with the harvest, but also helps exterminate monsters in the area. The thought of a monster mash makes Fate's stomach grumble in anticipation. Upon finishing up the farmer duties and heading home, a little girl walks by. As they pass, Fate notices that her eyes look like his, and she pieces out, stating that those kobolds are his to farm. Fate asks Greed who this lady is, but he insists that he doesn't know anything, despite her clearly being another existence like Fate's. Anyway, Roxy seems to to know that the strange axe lolly is a galleon, someone whose nation was destroyed by monsters, and a rare sight these days. They take the opportunity to walk home together. The next day, the precious grapes have been defiled by those blasted nobles. Here they are, ready to die. Something else catches the knight's eyes, a crowned beast born from aggression, which makes fate froth with hunger. The warriors strategize, but Roxy has no need for this, as she is a holy knight. Greed insists that the Giga monster would be too much for her to handle, however. Fate has to contend with a multitude of problems only he has to worry about, and figures that just diving into battle alone would be the easiest solution. And that he does, starting off with his edgy ranged attacks. Upon thinning the enemy's ranks, he charges in to dismember the stronger foes, increasing his stats as he clears the path to the Kobold King, who catches his lightning arrows with ease. Fate closes the gap, but is wounded and almost hit directly with an instant kill attack. Face down in a puddle, now is the time to pull a sneaky, and he gets the jump on his opponent. The battle is fierce, and through a brief exchange of blows, Tate lands a decisive hit, enabling Greed to gain enough stat points to activate his first level ultimate ability, a powerful ranged attack, which turns the kobold into ash. Fate reflects on the excessive destruction, and unfortunately, this release of power activates his frenzy, nearly causing him to go nuts. Later, the warriors find the scene of battle. Then even later, Roxy contemplates who could have caused such a commotion. Her mother can only focus on how she acts around Fate, though, and asks him to stay by her side, implying that he should marry her. Madame Roxy's mom is sickly, and has decided to place her trust in Fate, sure that his heart is pure. Fate isn't confident about this responsibility, and shortly after, finds that slaying goblins no longer sates his thirst for souls, meaning that he must move along to fight stronger foes and leave Roxy behind, or go nuts and kill everyone around him. At the tavern, Fate finds out that one of the triple threat trio is leading the upcoming Lich Hunt, and there will be an expedition to Gallia following after. Speaking of which, Roxy is assigned to that exact expedition, much to Fate's dissatisfaction. The Vlerics were at the heart of her assignment and toast to their victory. Now all that's left is to handle the Lich Hunt, led by Spiky Bluehair. Grape reflects on his situation and is approached by the knights, who are prepared to fight. Fate obliterates the plebs with ease and approaches the main course, who trembles in fear. Pape takes off his mask, revealing his identity. Cleric continues to tremble, but reassures himself with the pride he holds in his Holy Knight abilities, which are completely ineffective. Fate slices his sword in twain and tosses its severed half to the floor. This intimidates the criminal, who is given a heaping dosage of irony and tossed into several trees. He begs to be spared, but Fate not only hungers for his soul, but understands a scumbag when he sees one. Greed transforms into his first ultimate form, blasting his opponent's limbs completely off. Fate goes to question the Vleric about Roxy, who willingly volunteered to go to Gallia. This information doesn't help with anything, and Fate runs that nasty villain through, getting a significant boost in stats and acquiring the skills of a holy knight. Greed takes this opportunity to evolve again, turning into a cool scythe which can cut anything. Roxy crafted that gemstone into a butterfly and begins to depart to Gallia, leaving her loyal servants behind. They are forlorn at her departure, but it must be done. Roxy left a letter of recommendation in case Fate wants to be employed elsewhere, but he has already decided to become a wandering warrior to keep Roxy safe by proxy, and so he also departs to Gallia. Roxy delivers a speech to her squadron of knights, then meets up with Miria and Mugen, who I guess didn't know each other until just now. They verbally abuse each other, but Roxy intervenes. Mugen used to serve under Roxy's father and remains eager to avenge his death, as well as collect relics from the Gallian ruins. Miria and Mugen passionately kiss. Roxy is inspired. Meanwhile, these scientists discuss the Lich, whose victims were clearly killed with magic arrows from this thing, a weapon of mortal sin, of which they don't know anything about. This scientist is particularly interested now, and Fate arrives at a mercantile town, Tetra. He finds that the carriages departing for Gallia are waiting until the next day due to monster concerns, which Greed reflects on, causing Fate to schizophrenically talk to his sword. The next thing on the agenda is food, and a shopping trip involving a scabbard for Greed, who wishes for orichalcum. This plebeian named Set is harassed for not having enough money to pay some thugs to slay monsters. Luckily, Fate is there to do some counter-harassing with his god powers. They know each other from the village days, where Set bullied him for being a scrub. Fate has a few flashbacks to hanging out with his cool dad, who eventually died after being overworked by the villagers, after which they chased Fate away for being useless. Now, in the present, Set desperately begs him to assist their troubled village. Greed figures this is a good good idea, so Fate agrees, and they depart, despite the turbulent past he and Set share. At the village, the Elder isn't happy about Set bringing Fate back instead of some proper warriors. Ignoring the fact that they're in dire need of help, Set apologizes and caters to Fate, informing him about the specific dire circumstances. His wife was killed by monsters, and the village elder is being obnoxiously stubborn about teetering on the edge of extinction. Now, to protect his daughter, Set is willing to do anything, and so he fills Fate in on the details. There are some skinny flying boys who arrive from the sky to engage in naughty deeds. Green clarifies that these beasts are likely gargoyles, foes who are much too formidable for normal warriors. Set's fetus overhears Fate's conversation with Greed and bequeaths a circle unto him, which he promptly consumes. He begins to partake of the sustenance, but finds that he was poisoned and loses consciousness. The Elder set him up to be sacrificed to the gargoyles, whether he likes it or not, and they coincidentally arrive with perfect timing. The village doesn't stand a chance and is essentially destroyed in a couple of seconds, while Set quickly grinds up an antidote for Fate. He is successfully resuscitated, informed on the current situation, then goes to do his job, observing the absolute devastation wrought by the George Goyles. For some reason, Fate decides to use his sword first, even though these are clearly flying monsters, then proceeds to use his other melee weapon, which he finds is predictably ineffective given the circumstances, although the gargoyles seem to at least recognize him as a reasonably powerful opponent, charging up a big one, which is completely, and probably accidentally, countered by Fate's homing scythe throw move. That leaves just one more, and it's a gargantuan bird at that. This is, of course, easy peasy, and Fate leaps 50 feet into the air, slicing it in twain, and winning the battle. Well, unfortunately, the village is completely pulverized, and most of the villagers have been turned into paste, but at least Set and his girl survived. He asks Fate why he decided to become a warrior if it's so dangerous, but Fate has no choice but to fight, due to his gluttony skill. This inspires Set, I think, and he vows to get a job in town. Look at that moth! Set wants to be punched in the face out of guilt, and so Fate almost kills him, but it's all good. They say their goodbyes, then Vape goes to visit the graves of his parents, of which he speaks reassuringly too. Meanwhile, Roxy and the gang are on their way to Lanchester. Fate is on his way there as well, probably, and is ambushed by some thieves. His wagon operator clings to him like a bug on a log, begging so desperately to be saved. This inspires the robbers, but they are instantly exploded by the lolly from earlier. She requests a ride, and so the wagon accedes. She is heavy, or rather, her axe, Sloth, is. They exchange names, Fate of Gluttony and Mine of Wrath. She proceeds to consume his entire supply of jerky. When in town, this girl is saved from some dastardly ghosts by a holy knight, Rudolph Lanchester, lord of the city, who is preparing to head to Gallia along with Roxy. Fate is shocked that he was faster than her, but this makes sense, as moving an army tends to be slow. Anyway, Mine steals Fate's pay, then falls asleep on him. As they walk along, Fate is greeted by some people who are totally not cultists, then has multiple other encounters with similar characters. Greed figures that the markings symbolize some kind of caste system, which would explain why people like the Lord so much. Here he is, punishing those spooky ghosts for not doing a good enough job. I guess execution is appropriate for this? Meanwhile, Mine is still asleep, and Greed tells Fate about her and the various other deadly sins and weapons of mortal sin. Fate reflects on being given such a stupid skill, but Greed interrupts to warn him that if he lets his emotions slip too much, gluttony will take over. To prevent this, Greed gives Fate some insight into edging his hunger, and they go into the desert to get some practice on some worms. Fate can augment his range attack with fire now, but struggles to not go nuts. Mine awakens, eats some fried chicken, then gets warned about a mega sandworm, which Fate will probably encounter shortly. He senses it, finding that the beast is already engaged in combat with some poor adventurers. Fate distracts their quarry by unleashing a barrage of attacks. It counters with some wind, then is countered in turn, and decides to detach its orb to flee. Fate notices and charges up the ranged ultimate, compounding a little fire in there for extra effect. The sandy golem explodes, and Fate is thanked by the warriors who he just saved, introducing himself as Corpse. The next day, Mine is totally nude, which shocks Fate. After dressing herself, she becomes enraged that Fate has already downed the sand golem and ends up with half of the reward. Rudolph stumbles into the office to forcefully inquire about Corpse, but accidentally rubs Mine the wrong way and is sent into the stratosphere. And that's the end of part 1 of season 1 of Berserk of Gluttony. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, and if you really liked the video, you can sign up to my Patreon to hand feed me pellets while I scream uncontrollably. That's it, I think. Bye.